If you've played Marvel Rivals this year, you've likely run into people complaining about their team's composition. Not enough strategists, too many duelists. It's a problem people have asked for role queue to be added to fix. Role queue itself being a mechanic that came from a different but similar game called Overwatch, where players also faced a similar issue in team comps. Too many DPS, not enough supports. You can go back even further outside the hero shooter genre and see the same issue in Team Fortress 2, where a common signifier of a losing match was having 3 snipers, 3 spies, and 0 medics. But TF2 released in 2007, while Marvel Rivals came out just last year in 2024. With 17 years to crack it, why hasn't someone found a solution to this problem? Well, it isn't like someone needs to find a solution, as this problem can just be described as a thorn in the side of the players and developers. You're not going to run into imbalanced team comps every match. You don't need to devise a system to ensure it never ever happens, since it isn't game breaking. The players and the developers have learned to live with it. But on the other hand of the spectrum, what if there was a subgenre of games plagued by design issues like these? Problems so bad they completely overturn and ruin the original intent of the game. Games which, no matter what methods or ideas they add, have never been able to stem these day one issues. This is the Creature Sim dilemma, and once this year ends, it will mark an entire decade since it began with the release of The Isle in December of 2015. But what exactly is a creature sim? On a broad scale, a creature simulator will just refer to a game that simulates the life of a non-human entity. So for a simple example you may have heard of before, Wolf Quest, a game made for educational purposes where the player takes on the role of a gray wolf. But for the purposes of this video, Creature Sim encompasses a group of games that excludes Wolf Quest, as they follow a simple formula taken from the one game that led the trend called The Isle. In its simplest components, this formula includes the following. 1. Survival game stats like hunger and or thirst. 2. The ability to play as 2 or more species. 3. Multiplayer functionality. And 4. The combination of 1 through 3 in an attempt to create a player-made ecosystem. What sort of creatures do the vast majority of these games center around? You'd be right to assume it's animals, like in WolfQuest, but that's where the similarities end. As weirdly enough, virtually all of these games revolve around playing as a dinosaur. So why not refer to them as Dino Sims then? While this formula started with dinosaur games, it has become so prevalent it's become the default even for games where the focus isn't on dinosaurs at all, like Day of Dragons or Echoes La Brea. At the time of this video's making, however, the 3 biggest games made with this formula are all dinosaur sims: The Isle, Beasts of Bermuda, and Path of Titans. Because of this, most of my examples will be drawn from these 3. With that out of the way, what exactly is the dilemma of these games? These 3 games have generally tried giving themselves different categorizations to stand out. The Isle prides itself on realism, Path of Titans aspires for an MMO playstyle, and BOB is easily the most arcadey. But despite these differences, they all follow the same formula, and in doing so are trying to appeal to the same audience of people interested in a creature survival sim. An audience which, no matter which of these 3 games they play, will consistently encounter the group of problems posing a detriment to their enjoyment. These problems altogether, which were born with it to this day remain with these games, are what I refer to as the creature sim dilemma. To give it a definition, I describe it as follows. The inability to achieve a consistently enjoyable experience due to the following problems that have remained unresolved since the inception of these games. 1. Lack of goals. Absence of long-term goals that can be actively worked towards, leaving players with little else to do other than PvP. 2. Map hotspots. A tendency for player movement to concentrate at specific places, leaving the rest of the map empty. 3. Player misbehaviors, clashing of human behavior with expected animal behaviors. 4. Unbalanced playable ratios, biases that cause some playables to be favored over others in the community, leaving certain playables barely touched while others are overused. 3 through 4 are problems that stem from player behavior and the common ways they interact with the game and each other. 1 through 2 are problems that stem from the game itself, to the game's having a lack of oversight and or neglecting these parts of the game. Although I could, and originally planned to go over each of these problems individually, I soon came to realize that it was actually difficult to do that. These problems are all very intertwined, where talking about one often means talking about how it leads to or is caused by the others. To simplify things, I would say that these problems can be described as a chain, where one problem consistently leads to the other, which leads to another, and so on. This chain is lack of goals leads to map hotspots, which leads to player misbehaviors, which leads to unbalanced playable ratios. With this idea in mind, let's go through the chain by describing these problems, what causes them, and how they lead to the next problem in the chain. Part 1, Lack of Goals into Map Hotspots. A common point of criticism people make about the fundamental structure of these games is that they don't provide you with any sort of concrete long-term goal to speak of. It's pretty weird, but I don't exaggerate when I say that for 10 years, the best these games have come up with is essentially just telling you to survive. And while these are supposed to be survival games, even more traditional survival games don't leave their players hanging like this. While it's true that there are games where the goal is to last as long as possible, usually these goals are in the context of games that make that an active challenge. Games with wave-based PvE like The Forest, where the given goal becomes increasingly more difficult over time, turning the passive goal of just stay alive into an active challenge that feels more accomplishing every time you succeed at it. Just to establish this now, unlike those games, it isn't hard to survive in creature sims, nor does it actively get harder. While your character can die from PvE or PvP based sources, neither are likely to do in anybody who actually knows how to play. Starvation and thirst, the most common PvE problems presented to players, can be easily circumvented by simple map knowledge. Know the map and you won't die of thirst. None of these games really make water a scarcity. Food can be more difficult, but for the most part isn't a pressing issue either. If you're a herbivore, you're not going to starve. I don't really need to explain that. As a carnivore, it's a toss-up depending on the specific game and creature you play. All three of the big games provide non-player sources of meat, and in the ones that give you this resource in spades, staying fed as a carnivore is as easy as staying fed as a herbivore. But even when these resources aren't available or sufficient, staying fed on other players is actually easier than you'd think. I'll get into why when we talk about hotspots later. Since PvE isn't a pressing challenge, that leaves us with PvP as the main obstacle to survival, and where the meat of the gameplay can be found. And in fact, I would even say that this is the biggest reason people keep playing these games. It's simply the main activity presented to players. These games do try giving you other things, but these just end up being comparatively shallow. Player combat is a deep and dynamic thing, providing tons of replayability to any game. If a major goal that needs to be actively worked towards isn't provided, players will default to having fun by killing each other. This is perfectly illustrated in Team Fortress 2 on the map called Hightower. This map is technically supposed to be the game mode Payload Race, where opposing teams have to race to get their cars to the end of the track first. But people playing this map rarely actually care about this goal, with Hightower being considered a de facto deathmatch map by the community. This is due to the map's design, where at the end of the track, each team needs to slowly raise their cart on an elevator to get to the end goal, which will drop down to the bottom if nobody is on it. Because of this, Hightower is one of the most pain in the ass endings of any payload map in the game, so much so that players become outright bored with the goal presented and decide they'd rather just focus on running around killing other players. When creature sims present similarly mundane alternate goals like collecting nuts, laying eggs, or just getting bigger, it's not surprising why a lot of players default to having fun by killing other players. Even if the devs themselves proclaim that the players are playing the wrong way by doing this, and then it's on them for designing a game that makes the players feel like playing this way. This leads me to the main point, which is that the most valuable resource in these games isn't food or water, but simply other players. People play to run into other players and have interesting encounters. Whether it's to fight, observe, or just hang out together, this is the most interesting activity the game presents to its players. Leading to the second problem of the dilemma, map hotspots. Creature sims usually have big maps. They're essentially open world games. However, you will find without fail that all of these maps have large portions of their maps that go unused, while the majority of their player base gravitates towards specific areas. These areas are called hotspots. Usually occurring around water sources, these are the places players will go to by default if they want to find some action. They're the places players have to go to if they want to reliably find stimulation. They even work like self-feedback loops, where once a hotspot is established and bustles with activity, it effectively turns the other areas on the map into dead zones. Players know that going to other places will be unlikely to reward them with any encounters, so they head to the hotspots. By going to the hotspots due to their high activity, they increase the hotspots activity even more, encouraging other players to do the same in an endless cycle. At least until the developers get fed up and outright force players to move out of the hotspot by changing the map so it's actively detrimental to be there. And even then, this is only a band-aid solution, since the players will just pick a new hotspot to crowd around. But it begs the question, why are hotspots a problem in the first place? In real life, animals will congregate around water sources, like watering holes in Africa. But creature sims aren't really comparable to this. In these games, water isn't usually a scarce resource. Players aren't grouping around these bodies of water because there's literally nowhere else to drink at. Additionally, even real life watering holes aren't as extreme as hotspots. Animals go to watering holes to drink and then leave once they've had their fill. Creature sim players go to drink, eat, find other players, and essentially everything else, leaving the rest of the map barren. Remember what I said earlier about why finding food, even as a carnivore, isn't that difficult? It's because hotspots completely trivialize the challenge of finding meat by acting as areas that constantly churn out fresh corpses. People go to hotspots for action, both as aggressors and defenders. Fights are guaranteed to break out and bodies will drop from them. It's a constant, guaranteed stream of meat where the only risk is becoming one of the corpses yourself if you let your guard down while eating. But then, even this risk can be easily averted by playing large, powerful carnivores, playing in large packs, or eating while the big dinos are too busy killing each other to notice you. Keep this in mind for later, as it's a large cause for the disjointed ratios of playables in these games. Part 2. Map hotspots into player misbehaviors. Now that we've established what hotspots are, we can finally get into the most infamous part of the Creature Sim dilemma, player misbehaviors. If you play these games, you've likely already experienced them, as they're the most outwardly obvious problems you'll experience. Like I said before, the biggest resource in these games are other players. A lot of replayability and interest is gained from interacting with other players. But this can be a double-edged sword, as where other players can give you a fun experience, they equally have the power to ruin it. And as it turns out, in games where the base expectation is for everyone to play like they're actual animals, there are a lot of ways to exploit those expectations. For example, you can group with other species, commonly called mixed packing, and or group in massive packs called megapacks. The reason I consider hotspots the primary cause of this issue is because increasing the concentration of players in an area increases the chances of these behaviors popping up. While these tactics can and often are coordinated by organized groups using third-party communications, a lot of the time they also happen by sheer coincidence. Player A attacks player B. Player C comes along and thinks I feel bad for player B or I want to kill player B, so they'll join the fight, playing against whichever player they sympathize less with. Regardless of their choice, either player A or player B will end up pretty miffed that a third party came in and made things harder for them. Players come to hotspots to find some entertainment, and most of them aren't nice enough to just stay out of it and let clean engagements happen start to finish. Other than that, there really isn't much to say about player misbehaviors, because at the end of the day, these behaviors are just a product of players doing what comes naturally in video games, which is optimizing the quote unquote best way to play. It's the game that doesn't give the players any greater goal, leaving direct player combat as the main source of entertainment, which eventually leads to players optimizing their combat ability by abusing strategies like mix packing or mega packing. This innate focus on large scale group combat leads us to the next and final problem. Part 3. Player misbehaviors into unbalanced playable ratios. The most valued resource in creature sims are other players, but that would be oversimplifying things. What's actually valued are the potential interactions a player can have with those other players. This means that when players pick what creature they want to play, a major deciding factor is that creature's range of potential interactions. Now, what does this mean? Essentially, every playable in a creature sim has a range of other playables they can feasibly interact with. For a simple example, consider a terrestrial playable and a fully aquatic playable. Since aquatics are a minority in the playable rosters of these games, the terrestrial playable will generally have a wider range of playables it can potentially interact with. The aquatic, meanwhile, has to play in a bubble where it can only really interact with other aquatics, plus the occasional terrestrial that wanders close to water. Players are more inclined to play terrestrials since they're more likely to get active gameplay out of it. But we can go past this broad scope and get even more specific by focusing on the types of interactions players seek. In creature sims, entertainment comes from hunting and being hunted. These are the dynamics that lead to PvP and thus lead to fun gameplay. To be frank, when I say interactions, I really just mean what can you try to kill and what will want to try killing you. What this means is that a creature's inherent value lies in the variety of potential interactions it has with the rest of the roster. Because of this, there are two major preferences players have when picking their character. 1. Players will lean towards playing carnivores as they actively hunt, can be hunted themselves, and conflict with other carnivore species instead of packing together. 2. Players will lean towards playing terrestrials as aquatics, semi-aquatics, and flyers will generally be limited outside their favorite elements. 3. Players will lean towards playing medium to large sized playables for several reasons, including these three main ones. A. These playables can already fight with most of the smaller roster in early growth stages, and then fight with the rest of the roster in later stages. B. The majority of the most charismatic and popular animals in these games happen to also be the largest ones. C. In games with large power gaps between playables, small playables will be unfavored as they will be unable to hunt or be hunted by larger playables. Larger animals will either be impossible for them to fight or have no desire to try hunting them for the meager food they provide. So right off the bat, we already have two large abnormalities in what playables will end up being the most common. Unlike real-life ecosystems, in creature sims, carnivores will outnumber herbivores, and small animals will be less common than larger ones. Player versus player dynamics are the most interesting parts of these games, so creatures lacking in this aspect are unfavored. There have been ideas to add more types of interactions based on real dynamics in nature, but if I'm going to be blunt here, letting smaller animals eat ticks off the backs of bigger ones isn't going to do much for them. Players want to be deadly hunters and iron defenders, not Oscar the Fish going to his 9 to 5 whale washing job. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, shouldn't the quantity of large carnivores be limited by the quantity of meat on the server? While this is true in reality, it doesn't apply to creature sims very well, even for the ones that try to push meat as limited resource you need to hunt for. You are likely to starve at certain playables, but not the ones you think. In nature, the carnivores most likely to starve are those at the top of the food pyramid. It's the 10% rule in action, where the further up you go on each trophic level, the less energy is transferred. Creature sims can't implement this exact mechanism, but they do try to replicate it by making bigger carnivores eat more meat or drain hunger faster. The thing is that this simply doesn't work due to hotspots. Remember what I told you to keep in mind for later when we were talking about hotspots? Hotspots are constant streams of meat where the only obstacle is competition from other hungry carnivores. What this means is that you are more likely to starve as a smaller carnivore than as larger carnivores. How can this backwards logic be true? Consider the following. In real life, kill sites can't be perfectly predicted. Prey animals roam expansive territories, predators follow them, and acts of predation can occur at any place in these territories at any time. Because of this innate randomness, the most successful scavengers are animals that can cover massive distances, smell meat from massive distances, or both. This usually means that carcasses get stripped bare by smaller dedicated scavengers before large opportunists can get to them. Hence why we don't have bears that subsist exclusively off scavenging carrion like vultures. But in creature sims, this randomness is non-existent. People go to hotspots to fight, people die at hotspots. Hotspots are where the corpses will drop. Large carnivores know this, so all they need to do is sit around in hotspots themselves, wait for bodies to drop, and go push whatever won the fight off the kill and eat. In real life, this strategy is called kleptoparasitism. And while it's perfectly viable, it's not something any apex predator is able to exclusively sustain itself off of. Yeah, in creature sims you can do this. Even though a lot of large carnivores are designed for ambush playstyles where players need to learn how to get close undetected, a lot of players can completely ignore hunting skills and stay fed anyways. By just sticking to hotspots and going around acting like big meat Roombas, they rarely risk the chance of starving. And if by chance there isn't any fighting or corpses at the hotspots, they can just log out, put their creature into stasis, wait a few hours, and log back in to do it all over again. Lastly, since smaller carnivores lack the fighting power to get in on these food sources, they need to rely on finding other sources of food. Sources which are much more unreliable, like finding AI, finding players in areas that aren't hotspots, or just getting lucky enough to eat hotspot corpses before they get vacuumed up by the local garbage crew. Assuming you know how to play, you're more likely to starve as a small carnivore than as a large one. But even if resource limitations don't work, what about growth? All three of the big dinosaur games feature growth system mechanics. Even though it varies slightly from game to game, in summary, this mechanic works by having all freshly spawned players start as babies. It doesn't matter if you spawn in as a T-Rex or a Raptor, you'll start life as a bite-sized snack. From there, the player has to actively stay alive to grow, and given time will eventually reach their playable's adult size. Now, the catch here is that all playables do not grow equally. Two players can start as a T-Rex and Raptor each, but the Raptor player will be an adult in a shorter time span. In comparison, the Rex player needs to spend more time growing, during which it will be vulnerable to being killed due to not being its adult size yet. It's not a bad idea, as in theory this means that only skilled players get to play as giants. 10 people all playing Rex doesn't mean 10 full-sized Rexes on the player, if only 2 of them are good enough to survive that long. And if a player isn't up to this challenge, they have alternatives in the form of smaller and easier to grow playables. Sounds like a decent system, right? In practice, growth systems are never able to work this efficiently. I said earlier that only skilled players get to play as giants, and this couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, growth systems are just giant time filters. Instead of filtering players by skill, they filter them with massive time sinks. Surviving in these games isn't difficult. I already established why PvE isn't a major issue previously in this video. As for PvP, while other players can be major threats, they're also incredibly easy to avoid if you know what you're doing. Since the distribution of players on a map revolves around hotspots, all you have to do to grow safely is avoid those active areas. Never go somewhere other players frequent, always stay hidden in bushes, and never go out into the open for anything other than eating or drinking. This is why a common joke in the communities of these games is calling them AFK bush simulators. You only actually play the game for the few minutes you need to spend eating and drinking. Then you hide in an unpopulated corner of the map, inside foliage that keeps you out of sight, and wait. This is the most efficient way to play, as it minimizes your chances of contact with other players as much as possible, something which is almost mandatory as the power gaps between adult and immature playables means that being seen as a juvenile is usually a death sentence. Some of the developers in these games blame the players for choosing to play this way, claiming it's your choice to sit in a bush instead of walking around the map. But this is obviously a fallacious argument. People like to succeed in video games, and by default are inclined to play in the most effective way possible. This inclination only increases when big stakes are at risk, like competitive rankings or hours of investment spent in growing a character. The developers designed the game to be played this way, and if it's a problem, it's up to them to fix it, not the players. By the way, this basic strategy is just the bare minimum of what you can do to make growing a cakewalk. If you really need the extra crutches, you can use tactics like logging in when a server's player count is low, or have friends on adult characters feed and defend you. Unfortunately, even though growing in these games isn't difficult, none of the developers seem to realize this. Some have even doubled down by blowing up growth times to ludicrous lengths in an effort to crack down on the numbers of big creatures. It never works, of course, because all this does is filter players by how much time they can sink into the game. You can make a T-Rex take 2, 4, 8, or 16 hours to grow, and the end result will be the same every time. People with lots of free time on their hands aren't always going to be the minority on a server, which means time-intensive playables won't always be a minority either. If you want a good case study, just look at the time during which the IO added its hypoendocrine Rex to its old progression mode. In this update, the IO developers added a new playable that was essentially an upgrade of that regular T-Rex, called Hyporex. It was bigger, faster, and deadlier. It sounded like a bad idea, but it had two catches to balance it. 1. Hyporex took a ridiculously long time to attain. Excluding the hours it took just to get an adult Rex, you also had to attain 720 progression points on that Rex to become a Hyporex. For reference, one progression point was gained every minute in this mode, essentially making it time-based progression like growth. Do the math, and this meant that 720 points to become a Hyporex was 12 hours of surviving as an adult Rex. 2. Once you become a Hyporex, your hunger drain skyrockets. You would have to kill and eat constantly to survive. This means every Hyporex would essentially be on a timer before their death, destined to an end by starvation when their hunger outpaces the amount of meat available on the server. Yeah, no, obviously things did not pan out in this neat and tidy way. Let's just say the community got creative, or they just got cheap. Coordinated Discord groups pulled out every trick in the book to get and keep their hyporexes. Hunger Drain could be countered by just keeping your hyporex logged off, only logging it in when food was on the server, which you could find out by just having a friend go onto the server and scout it for you as a small and fast animal. If food problems became really dire, you could just have those friends play as large herbivores and feed themselves to you, which was especially easy at this time since herbivores had a way to bypass the time-based progression by eating progression plants. These were special plants that gave 1 point each for being eaten, which meant you could abuse it by getting large herbivores like Shantungosaurus and afford to use them as fodder since it wasn't much of a time investment to get them. As for getting the Hyporex itself, this wasn't much of a problem either. Assuming you knew the right people, if you were in with a big group, you could essentially just be coddled by Hyporexes into getting your own Hyporex. Keep your adult Rex hidden in a bush for 90% of its lifetime, only go out into the open to eat whenever your Hyporex bud kills, or your herbivore friends self-feed to you, rinse and repeat until you're also a Hyporex. It takes a long time, but like I said before, it wasn't difficult, and so was it an effective filter for stopping tons of players from getting hyporexes. Eventually this patch was pulled back and the hyporex was removed, as the problem got so bad that anybody who wasn't in one of these groups didn't even bother playing the game. It made sense because why would you spend hours getting a large playable in progression mode, just go to the wrong lake at the wrong time, get spotted by a Carno playing scout for his friends, and then immediately be beset upon by a hyporex that logs in to kill you. Even if you did somehow beat the odds and obtain Hyporex by your own effort, all it meant was eventually being ganked by two or more clan hypos. Needless to say, this was probably the singular worst patch I've ever seen in a creature sim in the entire decade of their existence so far. In summary, the lack of major goals leads to the creation of hotspots, which facilitate a giant mosh pit of unintended behaviors, which smaller playables usually get the short end of the stick in, causing them to be unfavored by the rest of the player base. The question now is, since we know what the problem is, have any of these games tried to fix them? Part 4. What's been done? Naturally, problems that have been around for 10 years straight do not go unnoticed, and all three of the big three have tried or plan to add countermeasures to these problems. Unfortunately, none have worked out too well, otherwise I wouldn't be making this video. Starting with the biggest issue, the lack of goals, all three games have done surprisingly little to address this. For starters, all three games feature growth and nesting as goals, so to speak, but they all share the same major issues. Growth is an incredibly passive system of progression that provides little room for players to speed it up with active gameplay. As a result, it acts less like a goal and more like a time sink. You spawn in, address your character's basic needs, and then wait. Path of Titans tries to change it up a bit by making growth tied to a questing system, but quests are so unrewarding and time consuming it's just as much of a chore as passively growing. Additionally, this isn't even counting the fact that once your character is fully grown, this goal vanishes. There's nothing to be gained anymore by staying alive, so players default to looking for action and getting into fights once they're adults. You do have nesting as a thing to do once you're an adult, but in two of these games, nesting serves no purpose outside of being a convenient way to spawn your friends on top of you. And in Beast of Bermuda, while nesting is a way to gain inherents and better characters, this ultimately just becomes a form of power creep. People nest to get powerful dinos with +2 inherits and important talents, grow those dinos to adulthood, and then, you guessed it, go to hotspots to fight and die. The same thing goes for BOB's growth system, which uniquely allows for infinite growth. BOB's infinite growth is a heavy topic. I could make an entire separate video on it, but to sum it up, while it technically works, it does it in the worst way possible. Yes, growing as large as possible is a goal you can always be working towards. Even hotspots get somewhat fixed because players who want to achieve large sizes don't want to go to the spots on the map where they're most likely to encounter and be killed by other players. This makes them actually spread out more compared to other dinosaur games. The fatal flaw is that growing in itself is still a painfully passive goal to work towards. Instead of actually giving players something to aspire for, the game just keeps them locked in the hide and grow as much as possible stage of these games. It leads to a ridiculous amount of power creep when massive sizes become the norm on servers. Suddenly, even growing an adult T-Rex is no longer considered impressive because the expectation is to have a 2.0 Rex at minimum if you don't want to be crushed by the resident server giants. This isn't even including how it encourages toxic clan dynamics as players become viciously protective over the lives of their virtual dinosaurs. They pull every trick out of the book to preserve their lives while taking out any possible threat to themselves, including but not limited to mega packing, mix packing, self-feeding, scouting, or even using subtle hacks like ESP. Lastly, we have the Isle's Elder system. Like BOB's infinite growth, this plans to allow players to grow past the normal adult size of their playable. Unlike BOB, however, instead of growing forever, elder characters eventually peak and then begin to decay until they die of old age. After dying of old age, you can pass your mutations onto your next life, which also makes them stronger. Do this enough times and you can eventually reach a cap on this bonus. Out of everything we've seen so far, this does sound the most promising as it's a goal with an actually defined end that completes a gameplay loop. But it still has problems. For one, this is still just a form of individual power creep, like in BOB. Once you're finished with min-maxing the mutation caps on your dino, there's nothing else to do but go out and kill. Secondly, this system essentially sells itself as a roguelike type of gameplay loop. Death is designed to be inevitable, and you're expected to die and do it all over again, several times. The problem with this is that it meshes horribly with the time sink aspect of growth. Troodon, the smallest carnivore in the game, has a base growth time of an hour and 40 minutes. This by itself is already ridiculously long, and it can be assumed that a single loop will be even longer since the devs plan to have periods of static growth so small dinos can enjoy their peaks instead of feeling like they went to the beach that makes them old. Then, consider that the expectation is to do this multiple times if you want to stack multiple mutation bonuses. While time requirements are a good way to force wise player choices, there's also a point where they can be overdone. This is definitely one of them, and the same applies for infinite growth in BOB. Systems that demand too much time from players will simply be inaccessible to or ignored by those players. This is not what you want for the core gameplay loop you want most players to be participating in. Moving on from that, we have had a few attempts at dealing with the other parts of the creature sim dilemma. In the Isle, the migration and diet systems were added as an attempt to quell hotspots. To explain those, diets are a mechanic forcing players to eat specific plants or animals according to their species. Migration is a mechanic that places migration zones around the map, designated places where a herbivore's favorite plants will grow, encouraging them to move around the map in search of their preferred food, which in turn will have the carnivore players following them. So far, it's been the best attempt at doing this, but that's not saying much when it's pretty much the only attempt that's been made. BOB tried playing around with the idea of natural disasters, but the problem with this is that they're too short term. If the map floods, players can just log out and wait it out. Same thing for wildfires or tornadoes. Beasts of Bermuda and Path of Titans both also tried playing with systems involving water cleanliness. A good idea in theory, since hotspots are nearly always tied to specific water sources. Unfortunately, in the best case scenario, all this does is make players cycle between a handful of hotspots instead of sticking to a single one. One last thing about hotspots, the community themselves don't do much against them. Even ruler realism servers, as strict as they are, aren't likely to dictate where exactly your character is allowed to go. The only community-made solution I've seen has been servers that ramp up their player capacity. It's pretty logical since if the issue is that parts of the map are going unused, turning up the total server population should increase the chances of less popular areas being populated. And while this does work to some extent, it doesn't solve the core issue. It relies on a trickle-down effect that just makes hotspots even more crowded and chaotic than on normal servers. That's not even counting the technical issues brought on by pushing games designed only for 100-player servers past that point. Player misbehaviors are the most infamous type of issue and thus have had the most calls for action against it, although the response depends from game to game. Beast of Bermuda tried adding the comfort system, a mechanic that gives your character a stat called comfort. Doing things like staying too close to other species for long periods of time makes the stat go down, and eventually starts hurting you if it gets bad enough. It didn't work that well since mixed packs can just work around it by spacing themselves out and only coming together for fights. Path of Titans has plans in the works to add a matchmaking system, forcing players who intend to play as a group to queue together before spawning in-game. This forces groups to follow the in-game group slot limits, and prevents revenge killing by exporting players to other servers upon death. Sounds hopeful, but we'll have to wait and see if it makes a difference. For unbalanced playable ratios, pretty much nothing has been done. It's actually sort of an accepted fact of life among the communities of these games that some playables will be way overpopulated, while others will struggle to retain any dedicated players. The closest I've seen to an attempt at addressing this was an unofficial IO server customizing their server so that players would be locked out of spawning in as specific playables if there were already a certain number of that creature playing on the server. It doesn't work that well since it only locks you out of making a new creature of that species. If you already grew a locked creature beforehand, the server isn't going to lock you out of playing, even if the current population is oversaturated. I've seen the community suggest that the way to fix this is to make small playables more interesting by giving them new mechanics larger playables can't do, like burrowing. But this falls flat. At their core, the main attraction of these games are player conflicts. Whether you're a PvPer who actively seeks it out, or a laid back player who still goes to hotspots anyways because you want to be attacked by and have fun defending yourself from PvPers. Giving small playables cute parlor tricks might entertain people in the short term, but it won't help them retain any players. All you need to do to see this is to look at the dichotomy between the small playables currently in these games. There's a good reason why Path of Titans ramp for rank gifts, which can directly harass larger creatures by debuffing them, is played more than the Isle's Bepisaurus. The former can have heavy impacts on other players, while the latter is only a few steps above ambient duck AI. Speaking of unofficial servers, the last type of attempt made at addressing these issues are those made by the community themselves. For people who complain about the dilemma, this is actually the most common response they'll get when they bring up the blatant problems in these games. Just play on unofficials. This is because a lot of unofficial servers run a realism or rule server format, where players are required to play according to a list of rules. I would say these servers are a big reason why people have been able to play these games for so long in spite of their issues, because rule servers act as a safe haven from them. But they are far from perfect solutions, and frankly I wouldn't even call them solutions. To put it bluntly, choosing between rule servers and official servers is just picking your poison. When a player plays on a rule server, while it does free them from some of the problems I've talked about in this video, in exchange it subjects them to a whole host of other problems created by rule servers. It's such a massive rabbit hole of drama to go into that I could make a whole other video about it. But to sum it up, relying on human beings with inherent biases to regulate exactly how players play on your server leads to endless amounts of problems and social drama. I'll probably make another video giving my own idea of how I think the creature sim dilemma could be solved, but for now I'm just gonna leave things here. The biggest reason I wanted to make this video was just because, well, I got tired. I've followed this subgenre since the Isle dropped on Steam in 2015, and it blows my mind that even after 10 years and the birth of dozens of sister games trying to achieve the same goals, not one has been able to solve these fundamental problems. It's been going on for so long, in fact, I've even seen entire new generations of players come into the community with the exact same enthusiasm I once had, getting distracted and excited for the addition of new playables, completely writing off the severity of these issues, and believing that minor additions would be able to completely resolve them. I'm here to tell you right now that it won't. If you don't give these issues the attention they demand, neither will the developers. If all it takes to keep you happy is a new shiny toy being tossed to you every few months, the developers will think that's enough. And hey, maybe that is enough for you. I won't judge. But I will tell you right now that there will come a day when you get burnt out on it like I did, and start wondering when these games will do more. I'm not trying to be cynical here, but it's hard to not be after so many years of the same problems. It's been a decade, and while these games have technically progressed, they simultaneously haven't. All I'm asking is for you, the players, to ask for more, to actually think about the problems you have with these games, to not just hide in rule servers ignoring these issues, and to ask the devs what they plan to do to actually make their games better, to actually spend time judging planned solutions and determining whether they'll actually be effective or not. The big three games all have a bit of a competitive streak between them, since they're all working off the same subgenre formula. While I personally used to have my own biases and favorites, I can no longer say that I do. The only game I'll really care about will be the first one to solve the creature sim dilemma. This is my message to all the lead developers of these games. Pull off what at this point feels impossible, and I can guarantee you that your game will garner the biggest player base overnight. Because at the end of the day, what players want most from these games is simply an authentic, meaningful gameplay experience.